Traumatic brain injuries can have lifelong impacts on cognitive and psychological function. Today's guest studies these injuries among survivors of domestic violence and says they have serious mental health impacts. She's Dr. Eve Valera this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University.
And I'm G. Wayne Miller with the Providence Journal.
This week, we're joined by Dr. Eve Valera, an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a research scientist whose work over the last 2.5 decades has focused on the impact of brain injury resulting from domestic violence. Eve, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is a serious topic, and it blends both sort of human behavior and brain science. How did you get into this work in the first place?
I got into this work because, like you said, I had a little bit of a double interest. So my training, basically when I was interested in going into graduate school, I was very interested in neuropsychology. So understanding how the brain does things to make the body do things, right? So brain behavior relationships. And when I went to graduate school, I also was interested in the idea of domestic and family violence. And so I was teaching a child abuse prevention program while at the same time volunteering at a local women's shelter. And so as I was volunteering at that shelter, I would hear stories of the women who might have been like hit repeatedly in the head with fists or hit in the head with a bat or something really pretty traumatic that could cause damage to the brain. As I'm learning about this in my studies, because I'm learning neuropsychology and how the brain can have problems if you get hit and the effects of brain injuries. And I'm like, wow. These women certainly seem to be sustaining brain injuries, and a lot of the things that they have problems with seem consistent with what people might see following a brain injury. So I said, what do we know about this? And when I looked at the literature, I didn't find a single article. There was nothing on the intersection of partner violence and brain injury. And so I basically said, I got to find out what's going on here, and decided to do that for my dissertation.
I think most people are familiar with traumatic brain injury, either through if they haven't been affected or someone that they love has been affected. They're at least familiar with the studies around NFL players, and maybe they've heard about the America's veterans who suffered from traumatic brain injury in the wars of the last 2 decades. Are there insights from those experiences that are specifically applicable to the work you do?
The insights from there, the insights might be that repetitive brain injury is certainly bad, right? The data that we have collected, as a field in terms of brain injury is largely focused on male data. And a lot of it is based on athletes or military folks, as you said. And a lot of the focus has been on repetitive brain injuries. And it's become pretty clear that, if you have one brain injury, if we call, a moderate to severe brain injury, that's a whole different story. But if we're talking about what people think about in the NFL or athletes, these concussions or these mild traumatic brain injuries, if you have one, most people will recover, eventually. They'll eventually go on and, there may not be, there's some data that suggests even one brain injury may have some long-term effect down the road. But overall, you're going to look like you did before you ever had the brain injury. But once we have repetitive brain injuries, then we start getting more concerned about the long-term effects. And that's a lot of that has been studied in athletes, et cetera. And for the women who I'm studying now, we know that they're sustaining repetitive brain injuries as well. So there's no reason to think that they are not experiencing potentially negative long-term sequelae as well. And in fact, based on what we know about brain injuries or what I may have looked at in my data, it seems that, if anything, women who are experiencing brain injuries from partner violence are probably going to fare worse than athletes, maybe even military folks for a couple of different reasons.
So
I would love to know what do you think those reasons are?
So for one, well, there's a couple. So if you're an athlete, you, for the most part now, I mean, not historically, but now you will automatically get access to care. You'll get treatment, you'll get sidelined. You cannot go back into the game until you have successfully gone through your return to play protocol, right? So you're ensured that your brain has time to heal, not only before you're doing strenuous activity or things that may aggravate your brain, the symptoms of your brain injury, but you're not going to sustain a second injury before that one's healed for the most part. Whereas women, they often don't report their brain injuries at all. They either can't get access to care, or they're afraid to, or they don't recognize that it's something that's important to do. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if we look at athletes tend to be healthier people, because by definition, they're playing a game. They have to be able to do certain things, to be in the game. And so if you have a healthier body, that's going to be more likely to recover well than a body that's not as healthy. And it's not like a one-to-one relationship or anything like that, but certain things, like when, in terms of recovery from a brain injury, if you have other negative things that are going on, that may slow down your recovery. Like if you have another bodily injury, for example, if you have like a broken arm as well, your body has so many resources, right? And so if your body's only trying to repair the brain and not repair something else, you're better. And if you have a stronger body, you might be better off as well. So, and then there are some data suggest that there are differences in men versus women in terms of recovery of function after brain injury. So there's a number of different things, but I would say that overall, women who are experiencing partner violence are on the negative end of that spectrum, unfortunately, in terms of recovering well and quickly.
So can you talk to us about some of the effects of brain injury, particularly among women and the people you study? And I guess you could break those down into two categories. One would be the immediate effect, what happens after a woman is punched or kicked or hit in the head, and then the longer term that you mentioned before. A long conversation, but talk about that.
Sure. So we don't have a lot of data on exactly the immediate effects in terms of who I have studied so far, in terms of like right afterwards. Like I may know that they sustained a concussion because either they lost consciousness or they couldn't remember part of what happened, or they're really dazed and disoriented, et cetera. And then they may have had symptoms for a while after that, may have had headaches. But we haven't been able to study that really well because we don't usually see these women right after their brain injuries. The data that I've collected has been collected based on women who have come in and their most recent brain injury may be 5 years or something. Or it's typically a range. So some people are a little more recent, but some people are down the road. But a lot of them, the majority of the women who I've interviewed have sustained repeated brain injuries. And the data that I've collected show that the more brain injuries a woman sustains, the more difficulty she has learning a list of words and remembering that list of words later on. And then also doing a task, we call it a cognitive flexibility task. We have to sort of change what you're doing cognitively quickly back and forth from one to the other. And so we show a relationship there. And then we also show a relationship where the more brain injuries the woman has, the higher score she may have on, unfortunately, psychological distress scales like depression, anxiety, PTSD, symptomatology, and worry. So really, when we look at this more as a whole and not just the one specific brain injury, but her history of brain injuries, we see elevated levels of psychological distress and a relationship between those brain injuries and memory, learning, and cognitive flexibility.
Eve, can you talk about strangulation? That is another type of injury, a related injury that certainly has an effect on the brain that you have studied and I think perhaps is lesser known than some of the more obvious types of violence?
Absolutely, and that's a really good question. Strangulation is important to understand in a lot of ways. One, one reason it's important to understand is because it's a strong lethality indicator. So women who are strangled are much more likely to be murdered by their partners. And so it's a good thing to recognize, certainly if you're worried about the safety of the woman. And that's been something that's been talked about and discussed for a long time now. What's been less discussed about strangulation is the possibility that it may be causing um, basically a brain injury via an alteration in consciousness. So when you're strangled, it's an external attack on the neck, and it's depriving the brain of oxygen and potential nutrients that the blood may bring to the brain. And that type of lack of blood or oxygen to the brain, it basically asphyxiates the brain, at least briefly, right, while the strangulation is going on. And it's hard to study because, like in science, we can sometimes do experiments and understand exactly what happened, but we can't, ethically, and who would want to do this, strangle people and find out exactly what happens when you keep strangling them. But in my data, I have looked at the potential effects of strangulation related, what we call alterations in consciousness. And what that means is if they reported some type of either loss of consciousness or loss of memory for the event or confusion around the incident right after they were strangled. I do show that that is related to negative cognitive and psychological outcomes as well. And and what we don't know as much is how the interaction between strangulations and other types of brain injuries may be affecting the brain. Because if you think, you have one type of insult to the brain, okay, you might get some type of problems. Now you have another type of insult to the brain that may have sort of an overlap. But then when you have both of those, which a lot of these women do have, then it's going to be potentially even worse. So we're at our infancy in trying to understand that.
Eve, I'm curious as I'm listening to this conversation. Does the source of the injury matter? I guess is the fact that the people that you're studying are victims of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Does that produce a different set of outcomes and consequences than someone who's, in a Humvee that got blown up or playing tackle and taking too many blows to the head? Is there something materially different in the outcomes of people who are victims of violence?
So in terms of what's going on at the time, and we know that there are some similarities right now, because when I study this, I can see some of the same types of things that we see in other brain injured victims, right? But if you think about the differences between women and these folks that you just mentioned, so if you're in football, you may have a helmet, so there's some protection to the head. If you're playing football, you have a stronger neck muscles, so that may help prevent you from getting concussion as well. So there's certain differences in the structure or let's just say uniform between women and some of the most commonly studied folks. And the other thing is the psychological context within which the brain injury occurs. And so for folks in the military, they may be traumatized as well. I don't know exactly how everything works, but it could be pretty traumatic, obviously, to be blown up in a Humvee or be driving through and being afraid you're going to get blown up. Right. But when we're on the sports field, you're not going to have that type of fear, right? I mean, you're playing your game, you're probably happy, et cetera. But women who are experiencing partner violence are often walking on eggshells. Some of them have described it as like being in a war zone, being in the ring with a boxer. And so it's very terrifying. And many of these women have high levels of post-traumatic stress. So in that way, the context of the brain injury is actually quite different, because extreme stress is going to affect how your brain is working as well. So these are just a number of different factors that may change the way your brain responds to that injury and consequently its ability to recover effectively from that brain injury or quickly from that brain injury. And that's a really good point, and one which we're, hopefully we're going to be finding out more and more as we study these women, because we just haven't, so the field is in such an infancy right now that we know sort of the bare bones, but certainly we know there's negative outcomes, and the psychological stress is certainly not going to help that.
So, Eve, how do you find the people you study? I mean, you mentioned earlier, and of course this is well known and intuitive, that many victims of partner violence don't tell anyone. It's their secret. How do you find the people that you do study?
Yeah, so that's another good question, and it hasn't always been easy. So the first study that I did, I would say two-thirds of them were actually from the shelter that I was volunteering, within which I was volunteering. And so it's not as if, somebody can just walk into a shelter and say, oh, we would like to study you. I mean, that's just not going to happen. It's not acceptable for a number of different reasons. But since I was already associated with the shelter and volunteering there, they knew who I was, they trusted me. So I was able to have women who were coming into that shelter. I could, tell them about the study, et cetera. And so sometimes it's from a shelter. And then other people, there was word of mouth, people getting orders of protection, et cetera. In other studies, I've waited, a very, very long time before one person came in. And then again, it was because a shelter said, oh, here's the study. And one person came in and they're like, oh yeah, like she's cool, you can go. So, and then more recently, we've sort of advertised, and we've gotten other women who are in the community, and they may not have told other people necessarily, but they are signing up for the study because we're specifically saying what we're doing. And I think it's becoming, I think it's a little bit different now. I mean, we're still way behind where we need to be in terms of accepting partner violence. It's still very stigmatizing, et cetera. But we operate under the context of confidentiality, et cetera. So they don't have to worry about this, getting out to anybody else.
Do you do any post-mortem work? It's well known that, in the NFL, a number of people have donated their brains to research. And I think there's a center at Boston University, actually, that does some of this work, if I have that correct. And some brains have been donated, and when people who are going to donate die, those brains will go there. Have you done any work along those lines to actually look at the neuroanatomy of the brains of the people you're studying?
Yeah, so I have not done that. So by training, I wouldn't be able to do that, but I have very, very much wanted to collaborate with somebody who can do that. And I might. I mean, there's a couple of things in the works. I think it's really important to do right now. As you said, the group at BU has looked at a lot of football players. There's a couple of other athletes, brains who have sustained repeated head impacts and that found high levels of tau. And Aaron Hernandez, who was here, I guess, with the Pats for a little bit, he committed suicide in jail, and I looked at his brain and found tau. And so the next question is, well, do we think we might find that in women? And we don't have a good answer right now. I will tell you that there are two documented cases, though, one from 1990 and one more recently in the past couple of years, where there were case reports in which there were women who had been beaten by their partners. And when they did autopsy, they did find basically what you would, the signature CTE tau in the brain. And so it would have been diagnosed as a CTE case. But other than those two cases, we don't have that. But I think it's really important. And I actually have been trying to get the right connections, find the right people to do this. It seems so simple, like we should be able to do this. But despite lack of interest, it's not necessarily simple because it involves, victims and donating brains and then the neuropathologist, et cetera. But I think it's a great question. And I would love to see what we might find if we were to start looking at women who had histories of head injuries from partner violence. I think it's a really important thing that we should do.
Even getting ready for this interview, I read a piece in the New York Times magazine that cited a CDC estimate that 1 in 5 American women experience, quote, severe intimate partner violence over the course of their lifetimes. 1 in 5 is an astounding number. Do you have any sense of sort of the societal factors that are at play there?
Why partner violence is so common?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, part of it is we're in a very, I think overall the world largely is part patriarchal, and there's a lot of misogyny, and women are often second-class citizens or not citizens at all. So I mean, we can talk about the United States versus other parts of the world, but women are generally not necessarily safe overall. It's very common for women to be abused. I mean, it happens to men as well, but men are less likely to be injured from the violence, partly probably because of the physical difference in structure and strength. But partner violence, another reason I think partner violence is so pervasive is because it happens behind closed doors a lot, and it's very stigmatizing. And so people don't want to admit to it. And other reasons is because people may not feel they're going to be believed. There's, a lot of reasons why women may be stuck in a relationship with her partner and have to, basically feel like she has to stay there. Economic abuse, threats, etc. And women are murdered by their partners all the time, unfortunately, and they're most likely to be murdered either when they're leaving the relationship or after they've left the relationship. So there's reasons why women may end up being trapped in relationships for extended periods, and I don't know if I could probably talk about that for a very long time, so I'm trying to dial it back. And then just because people don't want to talk about partner violence. I mean, it's not like it's a fun thing to talk about. And if I were to mention it to somebody, I might be uncomfortable even mentioning it to somebody for fear I would make them uncomfortable. And I think people do get uncomfortable talking about it. So it's kind of hidden. And so it's sort of like a crime that can just keep occurring with few ramifications, because people don't want to admit it. And then I think some people may not even recognize that it's really violence. They may think, well, he loves me. It's just this thing that he does, or whatever it might be. But yeah, I wish we knew, but I mean, my only solution, or what I would hope will eventually change, is that we basically have a core curriculum that includes healthy relationships as one of the staples. That's not just like one course every year or something. For some reason, we as human beings are not understanding what healthy relationships mean overall. And I think the idea is that, parents should be teaching that themselves. We don't need to teach that in the schools. But clearly, when kids are witnessing their parents beat up on each other, or the father beat up on the mother, they're not getting they're not understanding how relationships should be. And as a woman, if you see your mother always being treated, poorly, you may think that that's just the way you're supposed to be. It's normalized. And so I think until we change the socialization of little boys and girls at a young age, I think this is just going to continue. And then we also need to make this a bigger conversation, open up the conversation. Don't be afraid to talk about partner violence. And one of the if you will, silver linings of COVID is that you can say, I know partner violence has gone up during COVID. I've been learning this, and I just wanted to check in with you. Are you safe at home? Because some people might feel like, I don't want to ask my friend that, because that would be insulting to say that their husband or whatever may be beating up on them or whatever, that may think they're going to offend them. But this is one way you could potentially do it. You could say, well, I just know what's happening. I'm asking everybody. I just want to make sure that you're safe. And then who knows, maybe you'll find somebody who wasn't safe and you'll be able to help them out. But I think those are the things we need to change.
What advice would you have for someone watching or listening to the show who is in a situation where this violence is continuing? What would you say to that person?
Got about a minute and a half, Eve.
I would say that it isn't just normal behavior. It's not something that has to keep occurring. I would say there are places that can offer help. And it may not be easy. There may be a lot of different factors that are basically making it very difficult to get out of that situation. But with planning and a better infrastructure, I think that it is possible to get out and to get out safely. If that's what they desire. If for other reasons they feel like they need to stay, there are probably other things that you can say, well, at the very least, create a safety plan in case things get really bad and you need to get out. Or in my case, when I think about brain injuries, specifically, I'd want to say, try to protect your brain, if nothing else, like, cover your brain, or, if there's going to be abuse, I mean, obviously you can't like decide what's going to be hit, but maybe try to protect your brain, and just know that, as part of, either maybe there's a lot of reasons that make it very hard to get out of these situations, but knowing that, your brain is very, very special, and we don't want to keep getting hits to it. And that may have long-term effects down the road, and it may be contributing to your ability, the woman's ability to get out without her even recognizing it. Maybe she thinks, oh, of course I can. I can't even balance a checkbook. How am I supposed to survive on my own? Well, maybe part of the problem is that you're dealing with post-concussive symptoms that do make it harder for you to do certain things. But once you get out of that relationship, once you're not sustaining these blows to the head and the anxiety, et cetera, associated with it, you'll be better able to deal with those things. Maybe your headaches will subside, et cetera. And so I would say that we want to, offer help. And then there are places that you can get assistance.
Eve, we can't thank you enough for sharing some of your work with us and for the work that you do. She's Dr. Eve Valera. That's all the time we have this week. But if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.